March 6, 1836. The walls of the Alamo have just fallen, and Davy Crockett has only minutes left to live. Here's the version you already know. Out of ammunition, he swings his rifle like a club, cutting down soldier after soldier until he's finally overwhelmed, dying on his feet, defiant to the last breath. It's one of the most famous death scenes in American history. It's in the paintings, the movies, the textbooks, carved into how an entire nation remembers the birth of Texas. But a growing number of serious historians now say that's not what happened. What if Crockett didn't die swinging his rifle at all? What if he surrendered, was taken prisoner, and executed in cold blood? And the legend everyone grew up on is a story Texas simply needed to be true. To understand what really happened to Crockett, you first need to understand why roughly 200 men were trapped inside a crumbling Spanish mission in the first place. In late 1835, Texas, then a Mexican province settled heavily by American migrants, rose up against the centralized rule of Mexican President and General Antonio López de Santa Anna. By February 1836, Santa Anna marched north to crush the rebellion for good, and the small garrison defending San Antonio de Bechar fell back into an old mission compound, the Alamo. The defenders inside were led by men who'd become legends. William Travis, the young lieutenant colonel, who reportedly drew a line in the sand and asked who would stay and die. Jim Bowie, the famed knife fighter, already dying of illness before the siege even began. And Davy Crockett, frontiersman turned congressman, who'd arrived from Tennessee with a company of volunteers just weeks earlier. Against them stood a Mexican force that swelled to somewhere between 1,500 and 6,000 men, depending on the account. However you slice the numbers, the math was never close. By 1836, Davy Crockett was already a celebrity. He'd served in the Tennessee militia, spent 3 terms in Congress, and built a folk hero image as the straight-talking backwoodsman who could out-hunt, out-shoot, and out-story just about anyone he met. After losing re-election in 1835, Crockett reportedly told his constituents they could go to hell. He was going to Texas. He reached the Alamo in early February 1836 with a handful of Tennessee volunteers ready to fight for a new republic. He had no way of knowing his death would become one of the most disputed events in American military history. The siege lasted 13 days. Santa Anna's forces surrounded the compound, pounded it with artillery, and slowly tightened the noose while promised reinforcements never really came. In the pre-dawn hours of March 6, 1836, Santa Anna ordered a final all-out assault. Mexican troops scaled the walls under heavy fire, broke through the defenses in multiple places, and the fighting inside collapsed into brutal close-quarters chaos. Within roughly 90 minutes, it was over. Nearly every defender inside the Alamo was dead. For nearly a century and a half, that opening scene was gospel. Fought to the end, out of bullets, swinging his prized rifle, Old Betsy, like a club, until bayonets finally cut him down. That's the death Walt Disney's 1950s Davy Crockett television series gave America, the death John Wayne gave it again in 1960's The Alamo, and the death that ended up in school books and history paintings for generations after. It's a clean, heroic ending, exactly the kind of story a young republic fighting for its independence needed its fallen defenders to have. But there's a document that tells a very different story, and it comes not from a Texan, but from a Mexican army officer who was actually there. Lieutenant Colonel José Enrique de la Peña served under Santa Anna during the siege, and years later, in a memoir he clearly never expected to become explosive, he set down what he says he actually witnessed. It has nothing to do with a last heroic stand. According to de la Peña, when the fighting inside the walls finally stopped, a small handful of defenders were still alive, surrendered, disarmed, and marched out as prisoners. Among them, he claims, was David Crockett. De la Peña describes Crockett being brought before Santa Anna himself, alongside several other survivors. A few Mexican officers, according to the account, actually stepped forward and urged that the prisoners be spared and treated with the customary mercy of war. Santa Anna refused. He ordered the prisoners executed on the spot, and Mexican soldiers moved in with swords and bayonets and carried out the killings. Crockett, in de la Peña's own words, reportedly met his death with quiet dignity, not swinging a rifle, but standing his ground as a prisoner with nothing left to fight with. Adding to the confusion, the handful of actual eyewitnesses who survived the battle didn't agree with each other either. Susanna Dickinson, the wife of a defender who survived along with her infant daughter, gave several interviews over the following decades, and her account of what she saw and heard shifted from telling to telling. Travis's enslaved man, Joe, also survived and gave an early account describing Crockett being killed fighting near the church. Neither of them claimed to have witnessed an execution firsthand, but neither fully confirms the died swinging version either, which is exactly why this story has stayed murky for almost 200 years. Naturally, de la Peña's account exploded into controversy the moment it became widely known. The diary wasn't published in English until 1975, and almost immediately, some Texas historians and descendants of the Alamo defenders pushed back hard, arguing the document was a forgery or had been heavily altered after the fact. Forensic document examiners have since studied the paper, the ink, and the handwriting, and while the debate hasn't fully died down, a growing body of historical opinion has landed on the diary being largely authentic. Historian Brian Burrow, who co-wrote the deeply researched book Forget the Alamo, has stated plainly that most serious academics today believe Crockett was captured and executed, not killed swinging his rifle in a last stand. Step back and look at the broader pattern of the battle, and the execution account fits disturbingly well with what we know about Santa Anna as a commander. Before the assault even began, he had raised a red flag over his camp, a deliberate, unmistakable military signal of the era, meaning that no quarter would be given. And we know that just weeks later, Santa Anna ordered the execution of several hundred captured Texian soldiers at Goliad. Men marched out under armed guard and shot in cold blood. A commander willing to order a mass execution at Goliad is exactly the kind of commander capable of ordering the execution of a handful of Alamo survivors, Crockett potentially among them. So why does the fought-to-the-death version still dominate popular memory? Partly because it's simply a better story. A defiant last stand plays better in a painting, a movie, or a school book than a surrender followed by an execution. Partly because Texas, in the years after independence, needed its fallen defenders to be martyrs rather than prisoners to justify the cost of the revolution and rally support for the new republic. And partly because Crockett's own carefully cultivated public persona, the unstoppable frontier hero, made a swinging rifle death scene feel almost inevitable in the retelling, whether or not it actually happened that way. To be fair to the traditional version, no serious historian claims Crockett didn't fight. By every account, he was active in the defense for all 13 days, right up until Mexican troops finally breached the walls. What's actually in dispute is much narrower. What happened in those final chaotic minutes after the breach, when a handful of defenders were still standing? Did Crockett go down swinging in that last desperate scramble, or was he one of the few men taken alive, only to be executed minutes later on Santa Anna's direct order? Even historians who accept the de la Peña account don't fully agree on this point. This isn't myth versus fact. It's a real, live historical debate. This is actually a pattern you see again and again in military history. Battlefield deaths get smoothed over, dramatized, and simplified in the retelling, especially when the fallen become symbols for a larger cause. It happened with Custer at Little Bighorn. It happened with the defenders of Rorke's Drift. And it may well have happened with Davy Crockett at the Alamo, not necessarily out of dishonesty, but because a clean, heroic death is simply easier for a young nation to build a legend around than a messy, complicated one involving surrender and execution. History, it turns out, is written by whoever needs the story the most. Whatever actually happened to Crockett in those final minutes, the fall of the Alamo became the rallying cry that helped Texas win its independence just weeks later. Sam Houston's forces shouting, "Remember the Alamo," crushed Santa Anna's army at the Battle of San Jacinto in April of 1836, capturing Santa Anna himself and securing Texan independence for good. The martyrs of the Alamo, Crockett included, however he actually died, became the emotional fuel for that victory, and their story has shaped Texas identity and American mythology ever since. So did Davy Crockett die swinging his rifle in one final defiant stand? Or did he surrender, only to be executed minutes later on Santa Anna's direct order? The honest answer is that we may never know for certain. The eyewitness testimony is contested, the physical evidence is limited, and the mythology is nearly 2 centuries deep. What we do know is that the real story of the Alamo is far more complicated and far more human than the legend lets on. If you enjoy these The Story You Were Taught Isn't the Whole Story breakdowns, subscribe for more and let me know in the comments which version of Crockett's death you believe, hero to the last shot or prisoner of war.